All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Deborah Ehrenberg, and I'm the Strategic Director for the Cancer-Free Economy Network. We're a national network of groups that have come together to prevent cancer by driving an equitable transition away from toxic substances in our lives and communities, because no one should get sick because of toxic chemicals in the places they live, learn, work, and play. Today's event is part of our Move for Cancer Prevention week-long fundraiser. If you're participating in the Move-a-thon, today's webinar counts as 2.8 miles moved. And if you're walking while you listen, you could be doubling that. Our Move for Cancer Prevention events are made possible by generous contributions from our sponsors, including Naturepedic, Mom Remedy, The Very Good Bra, Bug Bite Thing, Gay Brown, and Kristina Marusic. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Kristina Marusic is an award-winning journalist based in Pittsburgh who covers environmental health and justice for Environmental Health News. She's going to give us a sneak peek at her forthcoming book, A New War on Cancer, The Unlikely Heroes Revolutionizing Prevention. And if you'd like to pre-order that book from Island Press, you can get a 30% discount by entering the code webinar, all in caps. After Kristina speaks, we'll have time for some Q&A, so feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom at any time. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Kristina.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'm going to share my screen. Does that look right, Deb? I think it does.
That looks great.
Okay, thank you. So first, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you all so much for being here tonight. This is my first time talking about my new book. It's not actually out yet. It publishes on May 11th, and it's such an honor to have this talk be with the Cancer-Free Economy Network. I attended an event organized by the Cancer-Free Economy Network in 2019 that sparked much of the thinking that led to this book. So this feels like a real full circle moment to me. I also want to offer a quick disclaimer that this likely means I'll be preaching to the choir today in this talk about my book. So I'll thank you in advance for your patience if I'm telling you things you already know. And since this is my first talk about the book and I value this organization's work so much, I'd welcome feedback from you all on the presentation if you want to get in touch with me after the event. Okay, so without further ado, what if you invented a pill that could eradicate 2/3 of all cancer cases? How much money do you think you would make? Do you think you'd be Elon Musk rich, Jeff Bezos rich? Follow-up question. If we knew how to prevent 2/3 of all cancer cases, but nobody stood to get rich from it, would you still think we should do it? I have good news and bad news about that. I'll give you the good news first. The good news is that up to 2/3 of all cancer cases are caused by exposures that we can prevent. This figure comes from the US President's Cancer Panel, and it's conservative. A study conducted by researchers at the National Institutes of Health puts this number even higher. They say 90 to 95% of cancer cases are caused by preventable factors. But now, are you ready for the bad news? The bad news is that all of our market incentives are pushing us to continue focusing solely on treatments for cancer rather than prevention. This chart is from a market research company that serves investors. And as you can see, the global oncology market was valued at $286 billion in 2021 and is expected to reach over $581 billion by 2030. That box of text on the left, the top left, is from the same webpage, and I've highlighted the part where they're citing the fact that cancer cases are expected to rise by 47% from 2020 to 2040 as evidence of strong growth for the market. There's no similar market projection for cancer prevention, unfortunately. So in other words, a lot of people stand to get Jeff Bezos rich, or pretty close to it, by investing in treating cancer. But no one stands to make huge profits, financial ones at least, by investing in cancer prevention. Developing new treatments and cures is important. I don't mean to imply that it isn't, but while we continue to search for a cure, we need to do more to prevent cancer. These are some of the reasons I wrote my book, but like most people, I've also had my own personal experiences with cancer. In 2011, my younger sister Abby was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. She was just 25 years old at the time. Thyroid cancer usually runs in families, but no one else in ours has ever had thyroid cancer. So we were left wondering whether something in the environment could have played a role. I'm also a journalist, and in 2019, still thinking about those questions, I wrote a 5-part series on cancer and environmental exposures in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania titled Prescription for Prevention. These are some of the headlines from that series, and the series won a couple of awards, and I got a note from a publisher congratulating me and asking if I'd be interested in expanding these ideas into a book. 4 years later, here we are. A little more about me. Thank you for the lovely intro. I think you already know most of this now. I've been a reporter for environmental health news since 2018. Before that, I freelanced covering a wide range of issues for a wide range of news outlets. I live in Pittsburgh with my partner and our dog, Mochi. And as you can see here, Mochi is a very good dog. She's sleeping next to me and may make a guest appearance and wander around behind me at some point. My sister made a full recovery, by the way. I'm sorry to leave you hanging about that. She had her thyroid removed and has been in remission for more than a decade. And this is my sister Abby with her husband, her 2 very cute kids, and their goofy golden doodle, who is also a good dog. I'll also tell you just a little bit more about my employer, Environmental Health News. We're a news organization that was founded by a scientist named Pete Myers, who's an expert on endocrine disrupting chemicals. Our mission is to increase scientific literacy around environmental health among the general public. And we have a number of popular newsletters focused on environmental health, including Above the Fold, and we do original reporting too. So this is what I'll talk about today. First, I'm going to go over some of the new research and talk about opportunities for cancer prevention. I'll talk about why we are currently losing the war on cancer. I'll share a couple of profiles of people who are really leading change in this department, and I'll share some resources for ways to get involved. After that, not on this slide, I'm also going to very briefly read from the book before we take questions. Some of the things I learned while reporting on environmental exposures in cancer were shocking to me. The first was that since we started tracking cancer incidence in the 1970s, rates of childhood cancer have been steadily increasing. This chart is in the US, but this trend is generally mirrored at the global level. Cancer is now the leading cause of death by disease for children in the United States. From 1975 to 2019, incidence of child leukemia, which is the most common type of childhood cancer, increased by 35%. Incidence of childhood brain cancer, which is also a common form of childhood cancer, increased by 33%. Nationally, 1 in 285 American children is now diagnosed with cancer before the age of 20. We've also seen a similar increase in certain adult cancers that are strongly linked to environmental exposures, including multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and testicular cancer. And as you can see, these are substantial increases during that time period. 76% for non-Hodgkin lymphoma is pretty alarming. And when I was reporting that series on cancer and the environment back in 2019, I interviewed a very smart epidemiologist and pediatrician, Dr. Phil Landrigan, who would later end up writing the foreword to my book. He said something during that interview that was a light bulb moment for me. He said this increase is too fast to be due to genetic changes. And he also said our basic diagnostic tools for cancers like childhood leukemia are the same now as they were in the 70s. So this isn't just because we're diagnosing more of what's always been there. He said this is a real rapid increase in childhood cancer rates. And the only other explanation is environmental factors. And that doesn't just mean exposure to cancer-causing chemicals and pollution. It also means any factors that originate outside the body and our own DNA. So that includes things like smoking and diet and exercise. Dr. Landrigan also pointed out that those lifestyle factors might play a significant role in adult cancers, but in general, kids aren't engaging in harmful lifestyle behaviors. So this photo is kind of funny because it's not typical and we assume it's a joke, right? Because for the most part, kids are not smoking or drinking. Their parents might do those things, but over time, the percentage of parents who smoke and drink during pregnancy has declined while childhood cancers have increased. One thing that has increased is the number of chemicals that kids and all the rest of us are exposed to on a daily basis. Since the start of the 20th century, more than 300,000 new chemicals have been invented. These are novel materials that never existed before on the planet Earth, and they're manufactured in enormous quantities. Global production of these chemicals is on track to double by 2030. And of course, some of them are incredibly helpful and have improved our lives in myriad ways. But most of them have never been tested for safety. And among those that have been tested, most of the ones found to be harmful are still in the market, including many that we know are carcinogens. In the last 50 years, only 5 chemicals have been removed from US markets because they've been found to be harmful. So where do we encounter these chemicals? These are some of the places we come into contact with cancer-causing chemicals in our everyday lives. This list is not comprehensive, and it includes some things that are suspected carcinogens. Many other chemicals we regularly come into contact with are known endocrine disruptors, which disrupt our natural hormonal processes and contribute to things like obesity and neurodevelopmental problems. Evidence increasingly suggests that endocrine disrupting chemicals may also play a role in the development of hormone-related cancers, like breast cancer and prostate cancer. This list doesn't include chemicals that cause other non-cancer health harms, of which there are many. And again, there are many more chemicals we come into contact with on a regular basis that haven't been tested for safety. Our contact with plastics is another major source of these exposures. A 2021 study by researchers in Switzerland identified more than 10,000 chemicals used in plastics manufacturing and found that about a quarter of them are substances of potential concern, meaning that they're endocrine disruptors, they can cause reproductive harm, they can damage specific organs or accumulate in the bodies of people or animals, that they're toxic to marine life, or that they're carcinogens. More than half of the chemicals the researchers identified as potentially concerning are unregulated in the United States. And 901 of those chemicals are approved for contact with food in the United States. At least 1,000 of these concerning chemicals, including some carcinogens, are harmful even in very small doses. And an additional 39% of the chemicals used in plastics manufacturing haven't been studied enough to determine whether they're hazardous. That bottom fact about the lawsuits comes from a separate study by a think tank that estimated that lawsuits against the plastics industry for health and environmental harm will exceed $20 billion by 2030. And these are some of the reasons for that. So now that we've seen some of the research, let's talk about how our war on cancer is going so far. We're much better than we used to be at treating cancer, but we're generally getting more of it. In fact, 1 in every 3 Americans can expect to get a cancer diagnosis in their lifetimes. And just because we're better at treatments doesn't mean we've solved the problem of cancer. More than 1,000 Americans still die of the disease every day. And treatment is difficult. Therapies like chemo can have side effects that last for a lifetime, and survivors live with the fear that their disease might come back, feeling anxiety and deja vu every time they have to go in for a follow-up scan. So you've seen the statistics. We're not winning this war right now. If this story sounds familiar, you may also be aware of how our war on drugs, our war on crime, and our war on poverty are going. The US has a tenuous history with endless wars of this nature. But the main reason we're not successfully preventing cancer is that we're not funding prevention. Globally, just 7 to 9% of all cancer funding goes toward prevention. I'm a pacifist personally, but if we stick with the war metaphor and we use the more generous estimate of 9%, this would be like spending 91% of our war budget on treating soldiers who came back from the battlefield wounded, and just 9% of our funding on offensive and defensive measures that could prevent them from getting wounded in the first place. I know none of us here are war experts. I suspect that we're not. You can correct me afterwards if I'm wrong about that. But does this sound like the correct budget for a successful war to anyone? No, right? It's time to launch an offensive war against cancer in the form of prevention. Right now, the tiny bit of funding that does go toward cancer prevention primarily focuses on lifestyle choices like not smoking, diet, and exercise. Those things are important, of course. They matter and they're worth prioritizing for lots of reasons. But as we've learned, those are not the only things that influence our cancer risk. Sometimes people can feel empowered by focusing on those things that are within their individual control, but that's a lot of responsibility. And so it can feel disempowering too. I spoke with one oncologist, Dr. Margaret Kripke, who referred to this obsession with personal choices as a blame the victim approach to cancer prevention. She shared a story about meeting a young man who'd made all the healthy choices. He was a long distance runner, he ate clean and organic, he'd never smoked. So he was confused and then absolutely infuriated when he got diagnosed with cancer. He'd been led to believe that this was something he could control through these choices, and he felt like he had been lied to. A better alternative would be encouraging people to make healthy lifestyle choices, while also acknowledging that there are numerous factors beyond our individual control that increase our cancer risk, and empowering people to advocate for a healthier world. The good news is some really smart, really capable people are already working very hard on this issue, including the folks at the Cancer-Free Economy Network. These are some of them who I profiled in my book. In addition to the funding problems we've discussed, another reason it's easier to advocate for a cure than for prevention is that it's the nature of prevention that we don't get to know whose life we saved. We don't get a heartfelt thank you from the family we spared from the trauma of receiving a cancer diagnosis. It's easy to feel empathy and want to pitch in when you know who you're fighting for, when you can put a picture of a little girl's face on a t-shirt and enlist help in her battle against cancer. The story of prevention is often told through numbers and statistics, which are important but harder to connect with emotionally. That's one of the reasons I chose to structure my book through profiles of the unlikely heroes, revolutionizing the way we think about cancer prevention. I wanted to humanize these statistics and help people feel connected and inspired when thinking about prevention. These are some of the people I spoke to, and in the book, I write not just about their work, but also about their lives. So their family histories and childhood memories and the personal challenges that led them to their work and that drive them in their work. I'll share a little bit about one of these stories today. If I told you all of them, my publisher wouldn't be very happy with me. So if you want to know the rest, you'll have to buy the book. This is Melanie Need. She's a clean air advocate in Clairton, Pennsylvania, where she lives beside a heavily polluting US steel industrial site, the Clairton Coke Works. It's the biggest and one of the oldest plants in the country for making coke, which is an ingredient used in steel making, and it's a dirty business. It's done by heating coal to extremely high temperatures, and the emissions are highly carcinogenic. This picture is Melanie outside of her house in Clairton in 2021. US Steel frequently violates clean air laws and just pays the fines because it's cheaper than modernizing their operations would be. The town regularly sees some of the worst air quality in the country as a result. In fact, the county that encompasses Melanie's hometown of Clairton is in the top 1% of all US counties for cancer risk caused by air pollution. And I also live in that county. It's Allegheny County, which also encompasses Pittsburgh. Melanie's family has been in Clairton for generations, farming on the land long before the steel company came to town. Most of the men in her family worked at the Coke plant at some point in their lives, whether for their entire careers or just for summer jobs, and some of the women in her family have worked there too. That's Melanie on the far left. Melanie was one of 4 kids. Over a span of 8 years, from 2013 to 2021, she lost both of her parents and all 3 of her siblings to cancer, respiratory disease, or heart disease. She's the only surviving person in her immediate family. This is the family home in Clairton where Melanie grew up and where she still lives today. After her parents died within 6 months of each other, Melanie learned for the first time how bad the air pollution is in her town and realized it likely played a role in her parents' health issues. She knew she had to take action. Since then, she has helped organize countless community meetings and rallies, pleaded on the local news for health officials to do something about air quality, and told her family's story in public testimony to local, county, and state politicians, including former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf. In addition to losing her immediate family, Melanie has also watched many members of her extended family and her community die of respiratory disease and cancer. She gets disheartened sometimes, but she's devoted to staying and fighting for her community's right to breathe clean air. Change is often slow, but it does happen. The local health department has stepped up enforcement of clean air regulations in recent years, and US Steel recently shut down 3 of its dirtiest, oldest coke ovens at the plant, in part because of pressure from Melanie and community activists like her. That won't entirely solve Clairton's problems, but it's expected to help improve local air quality substantially. Melanie's story moves me because I know there are Melanie Meads fighting for their communities all over the United States and all across the world. They're up against powerful forces, often facing impossible odds, but they stay and they fight for the health of their communities. So how can the rest of us join in the fight? Not all of us are in situations that are as dire as Melanie's, but learning about all of this and even hearing a story like Melanie's can feel overwhelming and scary. It definitely did for me at first when I started learning about this issue. And at first glance, it might seem like there are only 2 options here. One, to become completely obsessed about this, learn everything there is to learn, and strive to become an enlightened organic goddess who reads every single label and never lets a conventionally grown vegetable pass through their lips. My mother-in-law has decided to take this approach after learning some of this. She loves sending me YouTube videos about things like the cleanest cooking oils, according to YouTube influencers. Or option 2, to throw up your hands because it's too overwhelming and everything causes cancer nowadays, so it's probably best to just not think about all of this too much. But I discovered an exciting third option, which is what I'm really here to pitch you on today, and that is collective action to reduce these sources of exposure in our lives and go on the offensive against cancer. This doesn't necessarily mean we all need to become Melanie Meads and head to the streets with bullhorns, though for some of us that might sound like a great time. And if that's the case, you should absolutely go forth. But there are lots of different roles that different types of people with different strengths can play to help out this movement. And I'll talk about 3 broad categories here today, but if you can think of additional contributions that aren't listed here, I would strongly encourage you to pursue those and also tell me what they are so I can add them to my slide deck. Before I jump into those, I want to take a quick moment to offer some comfort to anyone who's still stuck plotting out how to become an organic goddess, or anyone feeling like the dog in the burning house. So while we push for systemic change, there are some steps you can take to reduce your harmful exposures in the meantime. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, just some quick tips, and there are more of these in the book. So when you're ready to buy new skincare, hair products, makeup, or household cleaning products, use a tool like the Environmental Working Group's Healthy Living app to pick non-toxic upgrades. Eat organic foods when they're available. Use a high quality water filter at home, like a zero filter. Run an air purifier at home periodically, particularly on bad air days. HEPA filters are best, but they can be expensive. You can create a low cost version by fitting a HEPA filter into a box fan. And if you Google that, it'll come right up. Using resources like those provided by the Healthy Building Network can help you source safer materials for your next home renovation project, and you can encourage your school or workplace to do the same. You can choose a daycare that's been endorsed as non-toxic by a third-party program like the Eco Healthy Childcare Program, or you can encourage your existing daycare to get certified. You can encourage your local schools to minimize kids' harmful exposures by using resources like the EPA's Healthy Schools Checklist. And groups like the Environmental Working Group have many more helpful resources about all of this. All of that said, I do want to reiterate that this problem is too big for any of us to entirely escape through our individual choices, which is why we also need to push for changes that will protect everyone. One thing I heard over and over from the people I profiled in my book is that they take these small preventative steps when they can, but we can't shop our way out of this problem. So what can we do? Number one, we can support cancer prevention initiatives aimed at reducing our exposure to harmful chemicals. One easy way to do this is by donating time or money to organizations that are leading this work to help power up their efforts. You're all doing this today, here right now, by attending this webinar if you're participating in the Move-a-thon. So pat yourselves on the back, check it off the list, great job. Another way is to sign up for these groups' newsletters and follow them on social media, so it's easy to quickly act on and amplify their calls to action. Things like signing a petition, calling lawmakers about pending bills, and voting on relevant legislation. And this list is just a very small handful of the groups that are leading this type of work. There's a much more extensive list in the appendix of my book. 2 is pushing for better chemical regulations. You can do this by contacting your local, state, and federal lawmakers to let them know this issue is important to you and urge them to support better chemical regulations to prevent cancer. You can also sign petitions related to better chemical regulations, and you can sign up for notifications about proposed federal and state regulations related to carcinogens in the environment. Then contact key decision makers about these bills when they're up for consideration. And I've listed a couple websites where you can do this here. They let you set alerts by keyword for pending laws. You can also donate time or money to organizations lobbying for better chemical regulations. These include some of the organizations that were on the previous list and more that are in the appendix of my book. And as you might imagine, the chemical industry has a lot more lobbyists. So you can also support efforts aimed at campaign finance reform, restricting the power of lobbyists, and increasing transparency in the US government. And organizations leading this kind of work are also listed in the appendix of my book. Number 3 is applying market pressure. And this is where you get to do that deep dive into those influencers on YouTube that my mother-in-law loves and start switching to less toxic versions of the products you buy regularly. The power of the purse really does make a difference, but you can amplify the impact of those choices many times over if you take a few minutes to tell both companies why you made the switch. So for example, tell company A you're not buying their hand cream anymore because it uses ingredients that raise your cancer risk, and tell company B you've started buying their hand cream instead because it's free of those ingredients. If you have investments, including retirement accounts, you can leverage those to increase market pressure on an even larger scale. Many of the cancer-causing chemicals we come into contact with in our daily lives are derived from fossil fuels. So you can apply market pressure by divesting from fossil fuel companies and investing in companies that are helping to advance green chemistry for safer alternatives to cancer-causing chemicals. And finally, you can help spread the word and get others to join us in this fight by reading and sharing my book. I'll leave you with this quote by cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead because it always makes me feel ready to fight. Please read my book and learn more about the heroes who are already doing incredible work to protect us from cancer and revolutionize this war. And please join the movement. I have a few minutes, I think, before it's time for Q&A. Yeah, so I'm also going to read a short excerpt from the book. So I have a copy here with me. So I'll just read for about 5 minutes and then we'll go to Q&A. 5-year-old Zaria bounced up and down as her mother lifted a wooden box full of cosmetics from the top of her dresser and set it on the bed. Her mom's makeup is usually off limits, so Zaria could barely contain her excitement as she pulled out compacts and tubes of foundation, lipstick, and mascara, asking, "What's this? Where does this go? And how do you put this on?" Zaria has a wide, gap-toothed grin, pierced ears, and a wardrobe full of sparkles. She's nearly fluent in Spanish. She's been in immersion classes since she was 2, and she's passionate about reading and math and makeup. Hey, slow down, you have to be gentle, said her mother, Ami Zoda, when Zaria aggressively stuck her fingers into an eyeshadow palette, smudging the tidy rounds of powder. As Ami explained what each item of makeup was and where it was applied, Zaria begged her to try them on. You can pick one thing to try, Ami said. Zaria chose blush. Ami tenderly swept Zaria's hair aside and brushed the powder onto her smooth brown cheeks. How does that feel? Does it tickle? No, Zaria said, closing her eyes. It feels nice. Within just a few minutes, Zaria had overcome Ami's resistance and also convinced her to apply red lipstick, shiny lip gloss, and shimmery eyeshadow. It's very subtle, Ami said sarcastically as Zaria puckered her lips while admiring her new look in the mirror. What does subtle mean? Asked Zaria. It means it's not too obvious, Ami explained. Remember, you don't need any of this stuff, okay? You'll always be beautiful just the way you are. Ami, a public health researcher and professor at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, is a second-generation Indian American with dark, curly hair, brown eyes, and a nose ring. She doesn't wear makeup often, but when she does, she favors bold red lipstick. Ami and her family moved to New York in 2022, but were living in Washington, D.C. at the time. I met Ami through my work, after she launched a program in collaboration with Environmental Health News, dedicated to telling stories by historically underrepresented and marginalized voices in science. As she told me why she tries to avoid cosmetics that contain phthalates, parabens, metals, fragrances, and talc, Zaria found a large white banana clip and affixed it above her forehead, creating a spray of bangs that made her look like she'd walked straight out of an 80s teen movie. Oh my goodness, you look like you're 13, Ami said. That's crazy. Go show your dad. Later, while chowing down on a dinner of crispy fish and broccoli at the kitchen table, Zaria repeatedly interrupted the conversation I was having with her parents to ask, Dad, is the lipstick still on? Can you still see it on my lips? After one such outburst, she added, good thing I have a mirror by my bed so I can keep checking while I'm sleeping. Her parents laughed. Oh no, honey, Ami said. You can't sleep with makeup on. It's no good for your skin and it would get all over your sheets. You're getting a bath tonight. Can we put on more lipstick the day after tomorrow then? She asked. No, Ami said firmly to Zaria, then explained to me, her school is closed tomorrow for the inauguration. She wants more lipstick the day after tomorrow because she's trying to impress her classmates. It was January 19th, 2021, the day before the inauguration of Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States and Kamala Harris as the nation's first woman, first Black, and first South Asian vice president. Before trying on her mother's makeup, Zaria had proudly showed me her new copy of Ambitious Girl, a feminist children's book written by Kamala Harris's niece, Mina Harris. I couldn't help but notice that Zaria's life bears some resemblance to the new vice president's. Kamala Harris's mother was an Indian American scientist who researched breast cancer, while Zaria's mom conducts research aimed at preventing cancer and other diseases caused by toxic chemicals in cosmetics and personal care products. Please, can I put on lipstick again just one more time, Zaria wheedled. I just want to be fancy for one day. No, I'm sorry, Ami said. You know when you can be fancy? For that wedding we're going to this summer. Maybe one of your cousins can help you put makeup on for that. Oh, wow, said Zaria's dad, Dave. That'll be such a special treat. Zaria frowned but nodded, then asked to be excused to go have some screen time. After she left the table, Ami said, this might become a problem. She's really into precedent setting. Now that we've let her do it once, she won't stop asking. A lawyer in training, Dave added, laughing. I have no idea where she's even getting interested in this stuff, Ami said. It's not coming from me. I think it's just so ubiquitous in our culture that she's picking it up, which is a little unsettling. One of Ami's earliest experiences with makeup was her own mother showing her how to use kajal or kohl, a dark black eyeliner used throughout the Middle East and North Africa, the Mediterranean, and South Asia. In parts of India, new mothers traditionally applied kohl to their baby's eyes to ward off evil spirits and negative attention. Ami used it regularly as a teen, but later learned that it often contains heavy metals that have been recognized as an important source of harmful exposures in some immigrant communities. It's one of many parts of Ami's personal and family history that inspired the work she does today. All right, with that, I will stop and I think we'll take some questions. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much. And Kristina, it was wonderful to see all the good dogs in your life. That was so sweet.
I'm glad you appreciated the good dogs.
Yeah. I want to start with a question that was in one of the registrations. Somebody had asked, can you tell us more about how parents and grandparents' chemical exposures are impacting our cancer risk? And do you believe this is having a compounding effect in each generation?
That's a great question. So research about these kind of transgenerational exposures is just starting to emerge. There was a 2021 study that found that a grandmother's level of the pesticide DDT in her body during pregnancy influenced her granddaughter's likelihood of having an early period or obesity. And those are two risk factors that are associated with higher risk for breast cancer. And previous studies had shown that a mom's exposure to the pesticide DDT can, during pregnancy, increases her daughter's risk for breast cancer. But before that 2021 study, only animal studies had shown this kind of effect for 2 generations. So it was kind of the first study saying, these environmental exposures that impact factors that influence our cancer risk might be affecting us for up to 2 generations. So there's a lot more research to be done on this topic. We're kind of just starting to figure this out. So it's a big unknown. Right now, the research is limited and we only have a couple studies on specific chemicals like that I'm aware of. But certainly it's worth asking about and worth funding additional research on that question.
Great. Yeah. Another question in webinar heard that we all have minute harmful particles in our bodies, which the body has no idea what to do with. Is anybody working on neutralizing or eliminating those?
I wonder if we're talking about microplastics or more broadly there.
Microplastics definitely fall into that category. I would look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't exactly know the answer to that question. So I don't want to answer it incorrectly. There are some studies on, dietary choices that can help to mitigate some of the cancer risk we get from things like air pollution, for example, looking at like antioxidants. But I don't know of any studies specifically looking at, how to neutralize or remove tiny particles. That certainly would be a big challenge.
Yeah. The question, I guess, is whether it's a bigger or smaller challenge than actually getting companies to stop emitting those tiny particles in the first place.
Right, which is a big question.
Yeah. All right. Another participant would like to know, what made you decide to write a full book as opposed to a collection of essays?
Yeah, so I had met, a number of these folks who are leading this research or who are activists. And I really wanted to tell this kind of big picture story. I'm a journalist in my day job, and so a lot of times I tell people's stories. For example, I've written stories where I talk to Melanie Mead for work regularly, but I really wanted to talk about this issue more cohesively and try to tell this big picture story in a way that felt new, which made me excited to do it in book form.
Thanks. You mentioned a lot of sources of cancer-causing chemicals. Do you also include mental and emotional aspects as a contributing cause of cancer, like stress? And then this person also was wondering, do you go into specific chemicals in your book?
So I don't talk about stress as increasing our cancer risk, but certainly there's research that indicates that stress is bad for us in myriad ways. But I do talk about specific chemicals quite a good bit in the book.
I like this question. Was there anything you found during your writing process that shocked you or really stood out, if you're able to share that with us?
Yeah, one thing that really surprised me, and that I think of right away is I was writing about, so Amizoda, who I just read about a little bit, is a researcher focused on cosmetics and personal care products. And she has written about what she calls the environmental injustice of beauty. And so one of the things she's looking into are the ways that people of color experience disproportionate exposures to harmful chemicals through personal care products. But then as I was writing the book, I was also learning that this applies in other areas too. So I was pretty shocked to learn that people of color are exposed to higher levels of air pollution in the United States, regardless of their socioeconomic status, whether they live somewhere urban or rural, and what state they live in. And the reason for that is redlining, right? We don't do redlining anymore, but it's this historic practice that's evidence of systemic racism, and the effects are lingering in a very real, discernible way, that people of color are consistently exposed to higher levels of toxic air pollution. And then, that overlaps with additional risks like personal care products and stress, which came up earlier. So I think I was just surprised to learn to what extent we really can't address environmental justice without addressing racial justice. And that's something that I talk about throughout the book.
That's great. Are there any topics that you would like to research as a follow-up to this book?
I love that question. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot is Environmental Health News is a publication of an organization called Environmental Health Sciences. And I mentioned that the founder is an expert in endocrine disrupting chemicals. And the science team where I work right now is working on a lot of really fascinating science related to the role these chemicals play in obesity. And then I've also simultaneously become really interested in intuitive eating, which is kind of an anti-diet. It's really helpful for people who are in recovery from eating disorders, but it's about learning how to eat kind of healthfully but naturally. And there's a connection here where we have years and years of studies that show that diet and exercise aren't actually effective tools for weight loss. That might be shocking to some people on this webinar, but if you go do a quick Google, you can find tons of data on this. And one of the reasons we're now figuring out is endocrine disrupting chemicals and the role they play in obesity and in turning on and off our body's metabolism switches. So I'm really interested in, if I were to do a similar project next, I've been thinking a lot about, something like a new war on obesity, interested in digging more into the way that many of these same chemicals that raise our cancer risk also influence all of these other kind of societal problems we have, and what are some ways we might tackle those while also tackling these.
It's a similar problem because there's not a lot of money to be made always in preventing obesity so much as in providing treatments for that as well.
Yeah, it's a very parallel situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Are you aware of any economists who are working to quantify cancer prevention benefits?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd be shocked if there aren't tallies out there somewhere that say, here's how much we could save in the public health sector if we, did XYZ steps to prevent cancer. Even at the local level, I've talked to, so for example, I was reporting a story on this new Shell ethane cracker that's recently been built about an hour outside of Pittsburgh that has a ton of health harming emissions. It's a plastics facility. So it's turning ethane from fracked gas into tiny plastic pellets to make plastic bags and disposable plastic packaging. And I talked to an economist at Carnegie Mellon University who was essentially just running the numbers to say, are the jobs benefits that are provided by this plant going to make up for the public health cost? And of course they were not. The public health costs went, especially out over 20 years. They have really good modeling tools to estimate those, and they're substantially larger than the economic benefits that we're expected to see as a result of this plant going in. So I don't have them at the tip of my fingers, but I suspect those studies exist. But the problem is that that's public health spending, and it's distributed across the people. It's across all of us, as opposed to being one or two people who stand to join the 1%.
Great. After all of this kind of dire research that you've immersed yourself in, what is giving you hope about our ability to change the situation?
I get so much hope from the fact that people who are really smart and really capable are working on this problem all day, every day, and they are achieving measurable wins. And I really tried to infuse that hope into my book. So I mentioned, it's this kind of big, scary topic. It can feel overwhelming, but the book is very solutions focused. And it's really showing that we don't have to start from scratch on this problem. There's already so much good work being done. And I feel, I worked with another reporter on a series about the mental health impacts of pollution and climate change a couple of years ago. And one thing that came out of that I thought was so interesting was a psychiatrist who specializes in working with people about climate anxiety and climate grief was saying that, oftentimes therapies for fears encourage you to be exposed, maybe expose yourself to spiders to reduce your anxiety to spiders, for example. But saying that telling people not to be anxious about climate change doesn't make any sense, because climate change is real and it's looming. And so she compared that to trying to convince someone not to be afraid that their house is on fire. And she was like, instead, we have to empower people to take action. And when people are taking action, they feel better. When people, there's all this scientific literature that supports that when people are feeling climate grief, climate anxiety, if they get involved and find steps they can take to make an impact, it helps them feel a little bit better. And I think that's true for this too. I think that when we find ways to contribute and feel like we're helping create change and advance change, it really can help with that feeling of overwhelm.
Great. Recently, President Biden relaunched the Cancer Moonshot Initiative with a goal of ending cancer as we know it. What would be your primary message to the folks working on that initiative?
So I'm excited to see that the Moonshot includes more references to prevention. The most recent plan that came out includes more references to prevention than ever before. In the past, most references to prevention have been about early detection, which isn't actually prevention, right? It's just detection. So I'm heartened by that. And I hope that the people who are working on the Moonshot will take a look at these funding priorities I talked about and start figuring out ways to address them. We need more funding focused on cancer prevention and getting cancer causing chemicals out of our everyday lives. So I hope that they're thinking about that and talking about that. I hope they read the book, and I hope they'll recognize how important it is to focus on prevention as we continue to search for a cure.
Could you talk about how smoking cessation proves the case that prevention works, but that removing smoking would still leave other cancers unaddressed?
Yeah, so smoking is a really important example that we have, right? We have lots of data on how much lung cancer was reduced by our public awareness campaigns about smoking. It's been a tremendous success. But we also have research that shows that smoking isn't the only thing that causes lung cancer, right? And air pollution is another huge risk factor for lung cancer. So there've been some really good studies conducted by some people who are involved in the Cancer-Free Economy Network, showing that if you remove the success we've seen from eliminating smoking, I'm sorry, no, if you remove smoking entirely, if you pretend like no one ever smoked in the last 20 years and look at how many people still get lung cancer and other cancers that are influenced by smoking, there's still a lot of cancer, and the numbers are higher in places where there's a lot of air pollution. So in Pittsburgh, where I live, for example, if no one had ever smoked, we'd still have a considerable amount of lung cancer as a result of environmental exposures. Whereas in like some very rural counties or cities with much better air quality, if no one had ever smoked, you see very little lung cancer remaining. So, we have this very clear use case that if we educate people about removing harmful exposures, we can prevent cancer. And then we also have very clear evidence that quitting smoking isn't the only thing we need to tell people about.
Thanks. I'm sorry, there were a few questions that we weren't able to get to, but we're getting close to time. And Kristina, I want to give you a chance if there's a question you were hoping we'd ask that we didn't, or if there's anything that to wrap us up with.
So I think we got to everything I wanted to talk about today. So if there's another question on the list you want to ask, I would say go for it.
All right. Well, would you like to talk a little bit about fracking and what we might be able to do about that, the role of storytelling and other forms of activism?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. Final question. But I've written about fracking a good amount as a journalist, and then there's a little bit about fracking and oil and gas in the book too. The emissions from fracking wells include cancer-causing chemicals, which raise the risk for people who live near them. But it's also important to recognize that the fossil fuel industry and the natural gas industry particularly are increasingly turning to plastics manufacturing as we shift away from fossil fuels and toward renewables in like the transportation sector. So I mentioned that Shell ethane cracker that's here near where I live. There's a bunch more facilities like that that are planned and proposed for the United States. And they all will create additional demand for natural gas, and then the plastics create additional harms. So it's this whole ecosystem of businesses that are kind of propping each other up, and they all also increase our cancer risk. So it's really important to think about the ways that these systems are connected. And you had sent me a question beforehand about how climate activism can help and has overlap with activism aimed at reducing cancer-causing chemicals in our everyday lives. And that's a big thread in the book too, that I talk about how these things are all connected and how in many cases, pushing for better regulations of cancer-causing chemicals has lots of other health benefits for us too, not just reducing cancer rates.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kristina. This has been really wonderful. And I just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to pre-order the book from Island Press, you can get a 30% discount by entering the code webinar. all capital letters. And be sure to check out our Move for Cancer Prevention events page. We have a whole bunch more informative and fun events happening this week that we hope you'll join us for. And if you're inspired to support our work, please consider creating your own Move for Cancer Prevention fundraising page and tell your friends. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you again, Kristina. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.